So I'm excited now to welcome and read the bio for our speaker, Rabbi Laura Bellows, who serves as Director of Spiritual Activism and Education at Dayenu, a Jewish call to climate action, where she supports American Jews to cultivate spiritual audacity and take bold action in building a thriving world for all. An experienced educator, facilitator, and activist, Laura previously directed Prose Door at Hebrew College, Genesis at Brandeis University, and she pioneered congregational programs at the Teva Learning Alliance. Laura received smicha, rabbinic ordination, from Hebrew College and moonlights as a soferet, a ritual scribe in the Boston area. And with that, I'll turn things over to Rabbi Laura Bellows. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Micah. It's so good to be with you all. What a treat. We are getting to start our week with some learning and with some community. So as we get ready to move into our experience together today, I'm going to invite you to just kind of give a nod to the world of urgency and efficiency, to the world of to-do lists, where many of us usually live. And we're going to take a step into the world of learning, which I would say is playful and can be spacious, can be creative, where you can take risks. Try sharing something about the texts we're learning that maybe is a little, I don't know, different than something you'd thought of before. So as we get ready to make that transition, go ahead and just take a deep breath. And I want to invite anyone who wants to drop one word, one intention, word of intention into the chat, something you hope to cultivate in this time together today, something you're hoping for in the next hour for yourself. Go ahead and drop those one words in the chat. Hope, lots of hope, honesty, calm and peace, equanimity, strength, solace, memories. Thank you all for carving out this time today, for being here. I know it's not always easy to hop on Zoom in the middle of the day or the morning, wherever you are. Maybe late at night for some of you, but it's really great to be together. So before we dive into that learning, first of all, keep the words coming. More intentions, the better. I like starting with some kavanah, some intentionality. Before we dive into learning, I'm going to share a bit of context about Dayenu, a Jewish call to climate action, and climate Torah, which is what the texts we are learning are some core texts from Dayenu's body of work that we call climate Torah. So Rabbi Micah, do you mind sharing the second slide? Thank you. Great. So Dayenu was founded in April 2020 because we know that more than 80% of North American Jews are concerned about the climate crisis, but most are not taking action. We believe that this is because many in our communities, many of us don't know what to do because it's really hard to confront the climate crisis. It can be overwhelming on an existential and on a spiritual level. So Dayenu was created to address both of these reasons for inaction, to give North American Jews meaningful ways to take the kinds of action that science and justice demand, and to support Jews and Jewish communities to face and move through some of the anxiety and angst that the climate crisis raises. And to do all of this rooted in Jewish community, learning, and wisdom. So you can jump to slide 3. Thanks. Our mission is to secure a just and livable, sustainable world for all people for generations to come by building a multi-generational Jewish movement that is confronting the climate crisis with, we like to say, spiritual audacity, thank you, Rabbi Heschel, and bold collective action. Next slide. So Dayenu has three main pillars of our work to build a just and livable future. Thanks. So three main pillars. I'll share these and then we'll move into learning. One is bold action. When we talk about bold action, we're talking about how do we actually move the needle on the climate crisis? How do we make a difference on this huge challenge? So we take a climate justice approach to this. The definition that we use for climate justice is that climate justice frames the environmental crisis as an economic, racial, and political issue, rather than one that is purely environmental or physical in nature. So certainly we hold dear the many forms of life that are threatened in this time. And some of the, those, I saw some people calling in from LA and from the Appalachian US South, and I'm really holding in my heart people who are recovering from some of the climate-driven extreme weather events we've had recently in the US. And I know that climate is affecting our communities all around the world. So a climate justice framework is one where we are shaping our campaigns and our work driven by an eye towards some of the economic, racial, I would also say disability and political impacts, rather than purely nature or environmental. You can click forward. Thank you. So one example of this, I just pulled a headline just from North Carolina recently, right? This is one of the ways in which the Hurricane Helene that hit in Western North Carolina disproportionately impacted people who are living in mobile homes. It's like one example. Can move forward. Thanks. So, as I said, we are focused on making a difference on the climate crisis through three things. One is bold action. The next one, go ahead, is movement building, meaning building an ecosystem of activists and Dayenu circles across North America, acting regionally and connected to a broader network with a kind of support we need to stay engaged for years to come. And the final is what we call spiritual adaptation. Thanks. We know that the climate crisis is not just a political, a justice, an ecological or economic crisis, but it's also a spiritual crisis and raises some big questions about life today and in the future. Dayenu's spiritual adaptation work, which is the work I have the privilege to get to lead, supports American Jews, though we can say North American here, to face the realities of the climate crisis, process hard climate emotions, cultivate joyous imagination, and move together to bold action. So in that realm of our work, we draw on Torah and music and art and spaces for conversation and connection on Zoom and in person to help us not burn out and to inspire us to move forward. So for learning today, we're going to dive into some of that spiritual adaptation work, the realm of climate Torah in our lingo. And we're going to do it in two parts. So you can move to the next slide. Thank you. And yeah, stay there for a moment. So we're going to do it in two parts. We're going to learn some text about facing fear and cultivating courage. And then we're going to pivot a bit and talk about active hope and moving to action. So again, this has been a particularly intense time. The climate crisis is not going away anytime soon, and we are deep at work finding ways to alleviate some of its impacts, to address it through big scale systemic solutions, and also to spiritually resource ourselves in the Jewish community and beyond to face this time, to adapt, to live well. So let's go ahead and dive into our first text. And as Rabbi Micah said, great, yeah, and you can move one more forward. Thanks. So Rabbi Micah said, I'll go ahead and read to kick us off. But I'll ask a few questions and I welcome your your digital hands or responses in the chat. Okay, so we have a bit from Kohelet, also known as Ecclesiastes. Kohelet is a book of Tanakh. It was written between about 450 to 180 or so BCE. And I was really struck by this line. Shomer ruach lo yizra, v'roeh ba'avim lo yizkor. Lo yiktzor. If one watches the ruach, they will never plant. And if one observes or looks at the avim, the clouds, they will never harvest. I'm curious if someone has any thoughts on like why? Why would watching the wind or observing the clouds lead one not to plant or harvest? Janet, go ahead.
It might seem like those aren't the optimum conditions to plant. Like if it's very windy, you put down seeds, they'll blow away, they won't get a good start. So you figure like people might say, well, why bother? Like these aren't the optimum conditions. And if you see clouds, it just like puts a downer on, well, it's not a bright day, things are not growing, the sun is not there to build them up. And you can look at like the glass half full or the glass half empty. That you could also see wind as helping to pollinate things and grow. You could also see clouds as they're going to bring water for the plants to grow. So it depends on which way you perceive it.
Yes, thanks. And we'll do Bob, then Susan. And I see there's some great comments coming in the chat as well.
You can't get anything done if they say with your head in the clouds. I mean, you can't spend your time up in Oz. You got to get back down to Kansas.
Thanks, Bob. Susan, what do you think?
Well, as detailed as Kohelet can be, it's also very metaphorical. So if you're constantly watching which way the wind is blowing, you don't take action. And if you're busy watching the clouds on the horizon because you're worried about it, you're paralyzed by fear. And so you're not going to harvest what has been planted because you're busy worrying about what's coming down the road. So it's very metaphorical. In my, to me, it was metaphorical as well as literal.
Yeah, and actually I see a comment also from Tanya saying perfectionism paralyzes. So this getting stuck in needing to get it just right. Yes, and let's hear one more on this and then we're gonna move on. I think I saw Amy. Go ahead.
Has always struck me as being very perfectionistic. Like, it needs to be just so. You're paranoid that any small problem could prove symbolic of something, especially if you'd been raised to think something specific was symbolized by anything. Like, does it have to be problematic that wind's blowing at large? Or does it have something to do with the fact that it went and came in through an eastern spot? Because, do we not talk about eastern wind being linked to a beast or something?
Thanks, Amy. And actually, I want to draw on also Pam and Marilyn are raising up some very real farming like realities that of course you have to look at the wind and of course you have to watch the clouds. You have to, turn on your weather app or whatever it is to know when to act and how to act. In this case, planting or harvesting. But I think it's also, I'm drawing on this both, of course, in the literal sense, we do need to be tuned into the realities, but I'm curious, going back a little bit to what Susan was saying, like if we look at it from a metaphoric perspective, what would you say in the context of our climate or environment work today? What might be the ruach? What might be the wind? What might be the clouds? And you can just drop in the chat thoughts on that front. Yeah, what is it that we're looking at and watching or fretting over? Yeah, perhaps fires, droughts, political climate, snowstorms. Mm-hmm. Yes. Which way are these winds going, and who is keeping us from harvesting? Snowpacks and sea levels. Yeah, feel free to keep those metaphoric ideas coming. Rabbi Micah, you can go to the next slide. We're going to add another layer to this. So hold on to this Kohelet. And this is, oh, there we go. And this is what Rashi, a medieval French commentator, has to say on this line of Kohelet. So he says that in regard to this idea of ro'eh be'avim, one who observes the clouds, what does that mean? It means he casts his eyes to the clouds, and when he sees them darkening, he is afraid to harvest because of the rains. He will never harvest because he was always fearful. So this gets to what some people are already starting to point at, and I want to sort of draw a line here even more directly to the question of how might our fears affect our ability to move to action? Maybe it's a call for mindfulness. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and relatedly, I wrote this question on there too. How do you know when it's time to take a risk, to be bold, or to take action? Or in this metaphor, to plant or to harvest? How might we know when that time is there? And you can respond in the chat or raise your hand. And I also welcome any particular moments, any short anecdotes of how you knew in a given moment that it was time to take action. Ayana. Oh, I'm sorry. Ayana just, never mind. Did not raise their hand. A lot of good comments here in the chat. So, right, maybe just the anticipation, the anticipatory fear. We sometimes talk about anticipatory grief. In this case, I think in the context of climate change, there's plenty of grief, but also there's a lot of anticipatory fear. Oh, great. Dee, go ahead.
Hi. As somebody who's taken a few risks in her life, I have a great belief in our, I suppose in another context it would be svara. It's the sort of instinct we're born with that there's a moment when it feels right and you trust yourself.
I love that connection between svara and how we know. I hadn't thought of that. Thank you. Amy, did you want to chime in?
Happy to if I can. It feels very easy for me to say that above anything, my intuition and or some kind of interesting timing coincidence seems to help give me some sense that I'm able to do something, even if it might seem dramatic, if not extreme. Hear somebody saying something? Yeah, right. Done in their perspective? Why not have a conversation with a complete stranger saying that you second everything? Or doing 180, completely challenge everything they're saying, because you're so shocked that you heard something.
Yeah, thank you, Amy.
Very
And
welcome.
I'm just going to read out a couple that are in the chat here. You can take a risk by saying it might not be the perfect season for this crop or plant, but it never hurts to try it, to give it a try. Yeah, like I think often, well, we won't go into a whole history of anti-Semitism and how it might affect Jewish communities today right now, but I do think that the pressure to be perfect is real for some of us, and that being able to take risks and, you know, sometimes hit the nail on the head, and sometimes we get to, you know, we get to learn from our risks and do better next time is part of not getting stuck in the fear. So I see from Diamond here, you can take a risk by saying it might not be perfect season right for this, but it never hurts to try. Margot, one needs to look to the clouds. One needs to look to the clouds or the heavens to inform one's actions, but to not let it stop one, rather to move around the difficulties, kind of see what your roadblocks are. And right at the point of being stuck, it's time to move forward even a little bit, just figure out what the next step is. And actually at the end of today, we'll talk about, or at the end of this hour, we'll talk about what might be some next steps, just one more step. Yes. Oh, some great comments here. Okay, keep reading what's in the chat too. I'll read one more here. Evan, you can always learn from failure. Also, success is rarely a perfectly linear line. Amen. So don't be afraid to make a mistake. When asked about why it took him 2001 times before he created light bulbs, Edison said something like, I learned 2000 ways to not make a light bulb. Great. So let's go ahead and we're going to move towards a classic, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it. There's clearly a very, yeah, lots of great comments here in the chat and out loud. So here we are, a little view. Some of you very well may be familiar with this, but it's this is the original quote from Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, or at least as noted by his student, Rav Natan, from Likutei Moharan. So actually, can I is there a volunteer who wants to read this? Who'd be up for reading this? So we can get a few other voices. Can raise your virtual hand if so. And you're welcome to read it in English. Janet, take it away.
Okay. A person must cross a very, very narrow bridge. And the most important thing is to not make yourself afraid. Kalal, not at all, entirely, completely, or as a basic rule.
Thanks, Janet. So just by way of crowdsourcing a bit of, for all of our Hebrew nerds in the room, I'm curious to hear, like, what other definitions of klal would you add to this? Klal is kind of this funny word here, right? She'adam tzarich la'avod, is that, as Janet just said, right? That the whole world is a very narrow bridge. Shelo yitpached klal. Okay, we have one definition of totality or completely. I'm curious, you know, and I listed a few definitions at the bottom there as well. All, yeah, klal, all. How might our definition of klal here affect our understanding of this last bit of the teaching from Rabbi Nachman? So, shelo yitpached klal, uniformly or all together is another definition, all the things. How might we define or understand this teaching depending on how we understand that word? Paul adds klal as like, don't do this to the point of an action. Susan, go for it.
You can be afraid, but don't be totally afraid. Because the most important thing is to not make yourself totally afraid or all afraid. Otherwise, you're not going to take any action.
So in other words, like, the fear is there.
Yeah,
but,
except that there's fear.
Yeah, but don't let it stop.
But it shouldn't stop you.
Yeah. I don't want to add to that. Oh, I see some good. Sandy added, right, definition 1 kind of implies fearlessness, right? Don't be afraid at all. versus definition 2, not being paralyzed by the fear, not, being able to still move forward despite the presence of it. I'm curious, like, again, for our kind of Hebrew grammar nerds in the room, when you look at this phrase, it's actually a little different than the classic song that some of us might know. Yeah, I'm curious if anyone else notices what else people see here. Ellen, go for it. Ellen, and then we'll go to Maria.
Hello? Okay.
Great.
What I don't understand, this is a bit of a diversion, but I don't think that people are afraid to act upon climate change. I think they may be passive about it, but I think the fear is more if you're acting, say, for Israel against anti-Semitism, you might be afraid of violence and things like that. But unless you're with an extremist climate group that is actually going and stopping an oil tanker and they're going to get arrested, I think it's more, from the Jewish point of view, the responsibility to look after our earth and ourselves rather than a fear. But maybe I'm just unaware of it.
Thank you,
other
Ellen.
people are afraid.
Thank you for bringing in that point. Let's hear from Maria, and then I'm going to pick that up again. Yeah, I really appreciate that, because I think even the question of what kind of fear are we talking about here? Are we talking about fear of action? Or are we talking about the fear of looking the climate crisis in the face in some sense? Anyway, Maria, go ahead, and then we'll.
Yeah, what I like about this translation is that it's different than how it is sometimes translated. And you referred to the song, but I'm not sure about the song, but it's often translated as, and the most important thing is to not be afraid. And that doesn't make sense to me, or that I have thought that's not a great message, because being afraid is something natural and helpful, but we can overcome our fears, or we can make not make ourselves more afraid and worried into inaction, right, and paralysis. So that's what occurred to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to pick up on something also that Rabbi Michael was just sharing in the chat. That gets just a little bit deeper to these last 3 words of this teaching, right? Shelo yitpached klal. Often we hear this cited, as Maria said, as do not be afraid at all. So not only, as people have picked up on, not only might there be a different way to understand that at all, it might be more about entirely, or at least that's, I would say, a pretty compelling translation. But also yitpached is a self-reflexive form of the verb. It means like, do not make yourself afraid, as opposed to do not be afraid. So what it's actually saying is, do not make yourself afraid completely or entirely. At least that is the way I am reading klal. I'm curious to hear, like, oh, I see some good other thoughts. Like, what is the difference there? And in the context of justice work or of climate work, what might it mean not to make ourselves afraid? Okay, Jerry chimes in. It is not so much fear as much as not wanting to be inconvenienced. Yeah, a lot to say on that front. Yeah. And I think the fear, I'll say one piece of climate work, one place where I've seen fear in the context of the climate work I've done has been people's fear that they're going to lose, about what they're going to have to lose or give up. So there's sort of the existential fear of, like, what might happen to my kids or grandkids or the world that I love or the things that I love in this world. And there's also the, like, I'm happy and comfortable, and I fear things changing. I fear having to give things up. And we will shift in a moment to some other approaches. Do not tie yourself in knots. Do not be overwhelmed. Yeah, not to only dwell on the negative and that kind of anticipatory anxiety. Thanks, Maria. Thinking too much can also lead to inaction. Great. Is it resistance to meet our own safety needs and prepare for disaster? We need to prepare to feel the fear and act anyway. Yeah, I think that's a good note to move to our next slide. Let's move to our next teaching. Great. Okay, it's a lot of text, but don't get overwhelmed. So we are going to dive for a moment. We've been talking about what we do at this field. You're looking at the storm clouds. You're trying not to make ourselves afraid so that we get stuck and don't act. This is a little snapshot of a teaching, actually not such a different time period. This is a teaching from the Kedushat Levi that I'm excited to share. It's Rabbi Nachman and the Kedushat Levi were both Hasidic masters, Hasidic teachers from the 1800s. And this is building on the story of Noah. So in the story of Noah, right, we're not going to go into the whole story about the ark and the flood, but there's a lot there when we're talking about climate. And you can check out more resources on Dayenu's website if you'd like to go deeper into the story of Noah and how we might talk or teach about that in the context of climate change. But in this case, I'm just going to draw on one line from Bereshit 6:9. Can I get a volunteer to just read? English is fine. The line at the top. Great, Diamond.
Hi, everyone. It reads, this is the line of Noah. Noah was a righteous man. He was blameless in his generation, and Noah walked with God. Genesis chapter 6, verse 9.
Great. Thanks, Diamond. And actually stay on because maybe I'll have you continue in a moment. So I just want to say righteous, right? This word here, what they're drawing on is tzaddik, like tzidkud, like tzedakah, like righteousness, that shorish, that root. So Noah is called a tzaddik. And the Kedushat Levi, he's coming in to say, essentially the Kedushat Levi is saying, wait a second, Noah is not the only one who's called a tzaddik, so is Abraham. But Abraham, I'm just filling in a little bit of the distance between this one line and what he's about to say. Abraham, when God says that God is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham pushes back, he protests, he says, hey, God, how about if there are 10 righteous people? How about if he negotiates with God? And regardless of the outcome, he speaks back, he negotiates there. And Noah, when he's told that the world is going to be destroyed, doesn't say anything. And there's a whole nother beautiful teaching on Noah's experience of grief coming out of the ark. And so this question of what does it mean to be a tzaddik? What does it mean to be a righteous person? And Kedushat Levi comes in, and Diamond, why don't you go ahead and keep reading the English of the Kedushat Levi?
There is a kind of tzaddik, righteous person who serves God. Hi, Lorenzo. But it's so lonely, and I'm sorry, give me 1 second here.
No problem.
There is a kind of tzaddik, righteous person who serves God, but is so lowly in their own eyes that they think to themselves, who am I to pray for God, to reverse God's bad decree? And therefore they don't pray. Now even through Noah was a great and blameless tzaddik. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He was very small in his own eyes and did not have faith that he was a powerful tzaddik with the ability to annul the decree of the flood.
Thank you. And hello to the visitor. Yeah, so the Kedushat Levi is essentially responding to this question, what's the difference between the kind of tzaddik that Abraham was and the kind of tzaddik, righteous person, that Noah is. And I'm curious to hear, and actually I'll just drop it in the chat as well. This question that he raises of, how we see ourselves. We just talked in the last text about yipached, about not making yourself afraid. I'm curious, like here too, how we see ourselves, the Kedushat Levi is saying, makes a difference. So did I actually paste that? I think I did. Maybe I didn't. Here, I'll put it again. So in what context do you perhaps feel small in your own eyes? When do you or we as a community feel powerful as an individual or as a collective? When are those moments when we get to channel or practice a kind of, I don't know, tzidkut, like righteousness that helps us feel powerful and be powerful? Thanks, Janet. Can you say any more about that, Janet?
Well, I don't know, maybe this is just something that's very personal to me, but sometimes like you think you have an answer to a question or something, but you're not sure and you don't know if you should raise your hand and say it. But then if you say, well, okay, like our rabbi often says in our Torah study classes, like there's no right or wrong answer here. There's just like, I'm looking for your thoughts. And if you say something and then others in the class say, oh, yes, well, I agree, and they elaborate on what you say, then they've kind of validated what you feel, and you kind of feel like better about yourself or more likely to continue thinking or going forward than if you say something and like everyone in the class is just kind of sitting there like hoping someone else will make a better comment. So I think validation by people that you respect encourages you to action and to self-esteem.
Yeah, it's interesting, the mix of I'm noticing the word self-esteem or self-confidence. Paul brought up self-confidence in the chat too, and I'm just thinking about the ways in which or perhaps the differences between power, knowing one's own power, and confidence, and self-confidence, self-esteem, and perhaps we need both. Susan writes, I feel powerful when I know what to do, right? When you actually have a plan, you have action steps, you have something to do. Susan, I see your hand up too. Did you want to share?
Yeah, it's kind of to expand on that. I tend to have a great ego, and so I always feel fairly powerful in large groups, when I'm speaking to them. But if I haven't any idea what to do, I'm trying to work with this one organization to be part of what they're doing. And I have tried several different times, and they say they want me to be part of what they're doing, but they don't get back to me. So now what do? And I feel very powerless in that respect. And so I feel powerful when I know what to do, but I don't have a clue of which way to turn. And so that's part of feeling powerless, is when you don't know what the action should be.
Yep. Yep. And I see that all the time, and I feel it too. I mean, it's been interesting to me. I've been at Dayenu 4 years now, and I feel more hopeful and like feel more sense of my own power in terms of climate work now than I ever did, than before I was working full-time on climate, because now I feel like I get to talk to amazing like campaigners and organizers and people who are deep in some of the work on solutions. And I have a sense of like some of the things we can do in a way that I think can be so overwhelming at times. And especially when you're trying to, move the needle on a big challenge that affects lots of communities in lots of different ways. thank you for sharing that. I think, Amy also picks up on, any strength I feel is generally linked to helping others and or making music. So just to put kind of a pin on that, like, first of all, I love that you're a musician or like making music. One of the things that often comes up when I'm speaking with young people who are trying to find their place in climate work is this sense that they have to be an activist or they have to be, a scientist or an expert in some way. And I think, as we were talking about before, this idea that we have to be perfect or be experts before we can take action. First of all, we need to, I would say, move through that and just get engaged, find a group, get engaged, but also that each of us bring different gifts and skills to this work in all different ways. So, one of the questions that I sometimes explore when we're learning this text is, that Noah and his family, according to the Midrash, Noah gets this call from God and he starts planting the trees, the gopher wood trees that are going to be used, the gopher trees that are going to be used to build the ark. And he cares for all these animals around the flock on the ark. There's lots of interesting teachings about Noah and disability justice by Rabbi Julia Watts-Belzer. If you want more about that, I can share more. But one of the things that I really appreciate about what Noah does is he kind of draws on some specific skills and strengths and perhaps a unique perspective. And that is something that I think is called for today as well, whether you're a musician or an organizer or a community member or a connector or someone who likes to host, whatever it may be. Margot chimes in here with the Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And Jay, great. I don't think we've heard from Jay. Constant teaching and changing ways of teaching can help youngsters understand the climate crisis well before it's time to repent. Yeah, and I would say it is here and now. It is happening. Yes, and Diamond, go ahead, and then we're going to move to the next text.
So since we are on the topic of spiritual adaptation for climate change, like you mentioned, it doesn't always have to be through like protesting or like activism. I know that you said that some people can do this through things such as maybe poetry or music. Can you share of any, I guess, people, groups, musicians, poeticians who have use that? Is there anyone in the class knows of that I could, maybe research later on?
Yeah, you're asking like who is doing music and arts work around climate?
Yes.
Yeah. Diamond, let's follow up. There are a lot of great people. I would say generally under this umbrella of cultural organizers, people who are like creating culture, music and art and poetry and comedy. There's a whole field of climate comedy now. So yeah, there are a lot of good people doing a lot of good work, and Dayenu, part of our spiritual adaptation work is music and arts. So we're really working on leveraging that as well. We have an event coming up. I can tell you more. Yeah. And Highlander Research Center. Yeah, a lot of great people have been leveraging music and arts as part of justice movements for a long time, as I'm sure many of us know, and it's happening in the climate world as well. So the good news is, and you can go to the next slide, Micah. Thank you. The good news is that we know what we need to do to confront the climate crisis and to slash greenhouse gas emissions by the end of this decade. If possible, we're going to do as much as we can toward that goal. While we can't stop climate change from happening and emissions are persisting in the atmosphere for long after they were released, it's not too late to prevent some of the most devastating impacts of this crisis, especially if we act now. One of the things that many climate scientists have said, and most recently I've been reading a lot of Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson's work, that every 1/10 of a degree that the Earth does not warm equates to lives saved. So we are going to draw, take a page from the book of Miriam. We're right now in our Torah narrative, we're right in the midst of, we just did Shirat Hayam, the Israelites crossing the sea this past Shabbat. and Miriam and the women dancing on the other shore. So you can go to the next text. This is a text from Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. Is that right? Yeah, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, great. Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer is a collection of midrash, of, I like to say, fanfic on Torah. It's an 8th or 9th century midrash that retells and expands upon the biblical narrative. It talks a lot about the book of Genesis and Exodus and continues from there. So one of the stories that Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer kind of weaves just in this couple of sentences is he picks up on the narrative of what happens on the far shore of the sea once the Israelites make it across. It says, Miriam began to sing and to offer praise before the Holy Blessed One, and all of the women followed her, as it says. And Miriam, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a timbrel in her hand. So he pauses here. He says, what? A timbrel, a tambourine, a drum, whatever this instrument may have been. How did they have timbrels in the wilderness? And his interpretation is that before they left Egypt, Miriam, these other women, prepared for themselves tambourines and dances. They actually packed them. And I was really struck by this and what it might mean to be on the side of the sea, the metaphoric sea, in a time when we today are in great transition. We're living in a time of climate crisis and also real upheaval. So what does it mean to pack knowing that we're going to get to celebrate? Pack, I'd like to say, like, for joy. It's a pretty bold move. I'm curious. I mean, even talking about joy, many have said recently, joy is a form of resistance. Right, Janet says, it's wonderful that Miriam and all the women were so optimistic about the future. Yeah, we need song and dance for community and courage. I'm curious to hear, what role do you think that joy or packing for a time when we will have gotten to the world we want, when we will have built a just and livable future? Why think about that now? Why pack the timbrels? Okay, so Jerry says, I find people have no interest in working to abate climate change when it means they have to change their habits, like stopping using wireless devices, which are major contributors. Right, so in other words, when we come at it from a place of scarcity, from a place of here's what you're going to be losing, it's a lot less motivating and yeah, who wants to do that? And certainly that's a piece of it. Certainly, like, changing our ways is a core part of confronting the climate crisis. But it's not only about doing that on an individual level. It's also about, oh, I see some good answers here. It's also about telling the story of the world that we want, right? So that we can enjoy ourselves as we make change. Evan says, giving a sense of our accomplishment or a target to aim for. So I want to pick up on that. There's a teacher named Rebecca Solnit. She's a contemporary author and activist. Some of you may know her work. She wrote a great book called Hope in the Dark during the last Trump presidency. And she talks about this idea of active hope, of hope that's born of action, the kind of hope that comes when we have a next step to take and a place to go. And she also talks about the climate crisis as being a crisis, not only, again, a political, ecological, a justice crisis, but also a crisis of imagination. That one of the things we need to do is to be able to imagine and tell the story of the world that we want, of the practices that help to get us there, of a just and livable future, so that we have something to work towards, not just dystopic narratives of that future. And I'll say at Dayenu, I've been having a lot of fun with Midrash. Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, this Midrash is one of the ones that we've been drawing on for a workshop called Midrash and Imagination, about sort of using Midrash as a practice to help us cultivate imagination for for the future, a thriving future that we want. And oh, there's so many good comments here. This is great. Micah says, I think it means, right, what does this mean? Starting to live our lives in a different way, how we eat, how we use resources. This is both an act of making change and also a statement that we believe change is possible and there is a future. Joy as resistance, Dee says. They don't get to steal the moments of good. Amen. Yes. We evolved as playing animals, building fun and celebration and community is necessary. Yes. And hope implies that there are actions to take. The alternative would be despair. Yes. So, and I would say despair is, you know, there is what we can do. And so to stop here would be despair. And I'm not willing to do that. And I am grateful to get to be in community with many of you in this big work that takes all of us confronting the climate crisis together. You can go to the next slide. I think it's our last quote. I brought in a little SoulKnit quote. Okay, can I get one? Let's see. Actually, I'm just going to read this one and then we'll wrap up. So this is from that book I mentioned, Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Solnit. All that movement building transformations have in common is that they begin in the imagination, in hope. To hope is to gamble. It's to bet on the future, on your desires, on the possibility that an open heart and uncertainty is better than doom and safety. To hope is dangerous, and yet it is the opposite of fear, for to live is to risk. So you can go to the next slide. Thanks. So big things are possible right now in our own communities. I know that, as I said, it can often feel overwhelming to figure out where to start on climate. Bill McKibben, one of the great climate leaders, teachers of our time, also says that one of the best things we can do is be less of an individual, is to actually join together, find an organization, find people in your area working on this. So Dayenu is, I'll just share, and I'll share a couple action steps and then we'll wrap. We are right in this moment after the US election where we're making a major shift in some ways. We're about to launch into some of the real possibilities and climate work on the state and local levels in different regions, even in the political context that now exists in the US. So we are pivoting to supporting Jews and Jewish communities at state and local levels. And this right now in this next era is where some of the real meaningful scaled kind of system level action is still possible and is critical. It's these kinds of cumulative actions that can really make a difference. Action where we are. We are about to celebrate Tu B'Shvat this week. And I think of like how each tree is planted where it is, but Tu B'Shvat ultimately originally was a tax holiday. It was a birthday of the trees that was set as a one day in which all the trees in the whole land would turn the next year, so that as a people, we could better account how many years old the trees were and know when to harvest the fruit and enjoy it. So like those trees on Tu B'Shvat, may we be rooted in our places where we're at, in our communities where we're at. May we find the people, the organizations, the movements to join with and to take action with, so that our actions alone may be scaled and may grow in impact. And may we stay connected and rooted in Torah and in learning, in the kind of inspiration of resilient and wise ancestors, and the knowledge that we are acting as future ancestors for those generations to come. So you can move forward to one last slide. I think I'll just drop into the chat 3 ways that you can stay involved with Dayenu if you want to. And I hope also you will donate to Laasok and support these things happening. So there are a bunch of events coming up, including climate music and arts events and workshops of that you can check out at dayenu.org/events. Our next big organizing call is happening on March 18th. You can go ahead and save the date, or sign up right there. I just dropped the link into the chat. And finally, I want to share that at Dayenu, we have a great JOC, Jews of Color, Sephardi, Mizrahi, Indigenous caucus. And our next caucus meeting is coming right up on February 26th. If you would like to be connected to that, please feel free to sign up. Thank you all so much. I'll turn it back to you, Rabbi Micah.
Thank you. I want to say a huge thank you to Rabbi Laura Bellows for this really moving and uplifting teaching. The language of hope came up over and over, and I think we need a little hope right now. So I appreciate that you brought us this opportunity to be together and to study together. Please do check out the links that Rabbi Bellows dropped into the chat. Dayenu is doing incredible work around North America. I'm going to drop a couple of links into the chat as well for Laasok, including how to support Laasok, which is the liberal Beit Midrash, as well as if you like this kind of study, we do a weekly half-hour study session that is focused on hope. It's called Tikva Through Text, and we study something different that is hopeful every single week, Thursdays at noon Eastern. And so I just put that in the chat, and we would love to have you join us for that programming. As well, you can also check out past classes on our YouTube channel, and I just put my email address. Please reach out to me and we can talk about further learning opportunities. Our next social justice and our text program is coming up on April 7th with Rabbi Heather Miller of Keeping It Sacred, who's a wonderful teacher. Some of you know her, and she'll be teaching on sacred couplings, interfaith relationships in the Torah. So thanks again to Rabbi Laura Bellows. Thanks to all of you for being here, for participating in this conversation, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care, everyone.